we're basically in a phase where we're trying to minimize the impacts of the crisis, but we will never stop being in crisis, right? Like there's no canceling or stopping the nature of this problem now. The really important thing, of course, is to look at all those things that have happened over the past 3 decades and go, okay, how do we stop it?
Hello and welcome to Planet Critical, the podcast for a world in crisis. My name is Rachel Donald. I'm a climate corruption journalist and your host. Every week I interview experts who are battling to save our planet. My guests are scientists, politicians, academics, journalists and activists. They explain the complexities of the energy, economic, political and cultural crises we face today, revealing what's really going on and what they think needs to be done. These are the stories of the big picture. Go to planetcritical.com to learn more and subscribe. My guest this week is Ketan Joshi. Ketan was a renewable energy data analyst in Australia and now works in Oslo as a researcher and communications consultant for a not-for-profit network of climate-focused communications professionals. Ketan has been researching, analysing and writing about the energy transition, the climate crisis, equity for a long, long time. And he joins me today to explain why the world is in crisis through the lens of climate delay. The actions that the fossil fuel industry took in order to delay governments around the world from taking action, to delay their in-house energy transitions, the greenwashing tactics that they have deployed, the link between wealth, power and influence, and the root of the inequitable distribution of resources that sees the planet buckling under the consumption of just a handful of nations. Ketan walks us through a report that was released back in 2021 that reviewed the science over the last 3 decades to explain why we haven't taken enough action, before going on to explain the link between energy use, demand, and sufficiency, a new concept that was explored in the most recent IPCC report, which introduces a ceiling on consumption as one of the strategies we must deploy in order to dramatically ramp down emissions and more equitably distribute the resources on planet Earth to humankind everywhere. I hope you all enjoy the episode. If you do, please share it far and wide. And if you're loving the show, become a patron on Patreon or support Planet Critical with a paid subscription at planetcritical.com. By signing up, you'll get the Planet Critical newsletter inspired by each episode delivered straight to your inbox every week. You'll also have access to the wonderful Planet Critical community who are full of inspiring thoughts, ideas, critiques, and determination. The links are in the description box below. I'm so grateful to everyone who chooses to support the project. I'm a vehement believer in ad-free and open access content, so Planet Critical wouldn't exist without the direct support of the amazing community. Thank you so much to all of you who believe in Planet Critical and keep the project going every week. Dan, thank you so much for joining me on Planet Critical. It is a pleasure to have you on the show.
It's nice to be here.
So my first question for you is, why is the world in crisis and what can we do about it?
Well, I think I'll focus narrowly on the climate crisis. There's obviously a very severe biodiversity and ecological crisis happening concurrently that tends to get a lot less attention, which is a terrible thing. The important thing to note here is that there are people who are very much more qualified to talk about those crises than I am. My career, I've worked on climate, so I'll talk a bit about the climate element of it. As it happened, I read this paper a couple of weeks ago. Thanks to the demise of Twitter, I started reading all the things on my reading list. It's incredible. I didn't know I was capable of reading. It's been a long time. One of those papers was a review of essentially the past 3 decades, right? So since sort of the early 90s onwards. And it answers this really straightforward question that I was a little bit surprised that we don't see asked very much, which is why are emissions rising, but why have we failed to stop them rising? So looking at all the efforts to do that and why they don't seem to have changed the direction of the curve over the past 3 decades, because people have been trying for a while. Like we're up to COP28 happening at the end of this year. That's 28 years. So this was a really timely paper, and it made some statements in it that I thought were really interesting and worthwhile to consider in the context of everything that happens in the day-to-day, right? Like when you work on climate, you kind of get this onslaught of news articles and they're always, you kind of generally tend not to feel great about them. And reading this paper really just made me think, okay, this is great context for everything that we encounter. Because you can kind of go, okay, well, this slots into why we've kind of failed in the past. And then the second part of your question is, what do we do about it? Which I'll come to in a moment. But it kind of slots it into 4 different buckets, actually. And some of them I don't really know much about, right? So there's one bucket that is about militarism. And so it talks a bit about the development of militaries around the world. The emissions impact of those militaries is obscene, right? Like, it's so massive, and they tend not to get all these different reasons, like, oh, it's sort of security and you can't really share the emissions data from these militaries. But it makes a great point, which is we're not really asking the question of, do we actually need militaries, and are we counting the climate impact of the militaries themselves? Because, of course, you get a lot of justifications for the growth of those militaries being, as the impacts of the climate crisis get worse, we're going to have to get better at fighting and defending the country, which is gross to me. Like, I kind of, it always, I come from Australia, you can tell from my accent, and there's a lot of this attitude, even from people who sort of tacitly seem like they support the cause of reducing emissions. When you kind of scratch the surface, they're like, well, I want to reduce emissions because I'm worried there'll be too many people seeking refuge in Australia, and I don't like refugees or asylum seekers, right? Like, it's kind of gross. So the whole military point I thought was really important, but I'm not going to speak too much to it because it's not my area of expertise. But one of them immediately struck me, and it's something I'm sure your listeners are somewhat familiar with, but it's worth. I'll send you the link to this paper so maybe you can include it in the podcast list. But one bit that I found really compelling was essentially the actions of the fossil fuel industry over the past 3 decades. So this puts it into 2 chunks. The first chunk being climate denial. So this was the sort of whole process of casting doubt on the science of climate change. I think people are generally pretty familiar with this. It's not really that much of a revelation. People kind of get that they went through this whole process through the 80s and the 90s, where they knew about the science, they knew exactly what it was saying. And their response was, well, we'd better kind of cast some doubt on this so that no regulations or actions get taken on it. And it didn't take very much doubt, right? Like, it was a very easy thing for them to do. They shouldn't congratulate themselves for this, because it's very easy to cast doubt on any science when it's emerging. And the urgency of the situation should have meant people erred on the side of precaution and treated it as if it was certain, even when it was less certain. And we know now, if people had done that, it would have avoided a lot of the harm that we see today from climate. And also it would have made action a lot simpler and easier, because we wouldn't have to take on such a steep curve for reducing emissions. The second chunk, which is my favorite in the whole paper, is climate delay, right? So this is where things get really, really interesting, right? Because this is sort of the really unrealized or unrecognized part of this whole subsection of what the fossil fuel industry is doing. So this is when a company or a lobby group or a government pretends that they're doing the right thing, and they're not, right? They're basically lying or being deceptive in their actions. So they're sort of saying, yes, we proposed X, Y, or Z, and the reason for that proposal, or the reason it's designed that way, is to prolong the use of fossil fuels. So even a company can basically say, yeah, we accept the science. We're totally down with that. It's all real. They can even say, we accept an end date. We accept an end date of like 2050 or whatever. That's the one you sort of get most. Yet their actions can still result in prolonging the use of fossil fuels. And the mathematics of this problem is that it's one which involves the adding up of greenhouse gases. So it's cumulative. A metaphor that I really enjoy is bathtub metaphor. This is when, you sort of imagine Earth's atmosphere as this bucket or bathtub that's filling up. And you can kind of set a date, even though you can kind of see it on the verge of overflowing. You can say, well, by 2050, I'm going to turn the tap off. And it doesn't matter, right? Like, if you kind of keep it, if you kind of stand there twisting the tap more and more open, and you tell yourself that, yeah, I'm going to turn it off in like 30 years, right? It's going to overflow. And then someone will say, what the hell are you doing? You're turning the tap more and more open. And then you can say, well, I have invested in this amazing new mop technology. So when it does overflow, you can really just mop it up and it's going to be fantastic. You don't need to worry at all. And so the reason I like it so much is because it's funny, as you recognized, like it's a sort of nice visual, but also it corrects something that we've been getting wrong about climate. And my background, I'm a former renewable energy data analyst. And then for a while, I kind of did like a lot of writing. It was very sort of wonkish, a lot of like analytics and emissions analytics and stuff like that. And the predominant thinking in that world is that you look at annual emissions, like ongoing, like what were our emissions this year? And the problem with that thinking is that you're not looking at the whole picture. You're not looking at what's in the bucket or the bathtub already. When you look at it that way, you sort of realize, holy crap, it's actually way more urgent than we thought. So it becomes less and less about the year-on-year reductions in emissions, and it becomes more about, holy crap, we need to solve this as fast as possible. And so basically the actions of the fossil fuel industry have been about stretching things out for longer and longer so that you end up with more in the bathtub. That's a real problem. But then they can defend themselves and say, well, what are you complaining about? Like, we still reach the same endpoint. We still reach zero by 2050. But if you emit as much as possible in the years before that end date, you still end up with like 2 or 3 times worse climate impact, right? So this is really the whole concept of an end date. The whole concept of a target or a single year, it was a good shorthand for this really narrow application of the Paris Agreement, and then it just proliferated everywhere. And the fossil fuel industry has been like, okay, great, we can use this, fantastic. And the consequence has been climate delay. So they can basically, I'll give you an example. The gas networks that run through every city that all of us live in, right? Like this is fossil fuel infrastructure. It pipes methane into people's homes, which they burn to heat their homes or to cook stuff. And this has been really this is a real struggle, right? Like if you shut down that gas network, you expose a lot of people, generally people in vulnerable situations. Like I'm a renter. It makes me making decisions about the place that I live in very, very difficult. And if you start shutting off the gas network, the people who are left on that network, i.e. people like renters, they'll get exposed to higher and higher prices, right? Mm-hmm. And so one solution that was proposed, so normally you might think a solution to that would be, okay, take some legislative action to protect those renters, right? As your first priority, from the changes that you necessarily have to make to the gas network, right? You can't keep burning fossil fuels. It chokes people inside their kitchens, from the direct air quality impacts. And of course it causes climate change. So that's not, you should help those renters in some other way. What the fossil fuel industry proposes is like, if you want to be nice to these renters, what you should really be doing is blending hydrogen into the pipelines, right? So, just 1%, don't ask us how we made the hydrogen. Just forget about that. No more buts. We're just going to put hydrogen in the pipeline, and that's us being kind to people at vulnerable situations, right? Like they kind of bring it like they're doing it under the good. And so not to let climate policy like myself off the hook, because there's a lot of disregard for people who are vulnerable to the different pathways that climate policies can take. But the fossil fuel industry is like 1,000 times worse, right? Because they're basically pretending to be interested in a social justice issue, but it's actually a form of climate delay. And then if you were to take that pathway, what they'll do is they'll produce a report going, well, I don't know what you're complaining about, because if you sort of very gradually increase the amount of hydrogen in these pipelines, then by 2050, you hit the same spot as if you were to pay for induction stoves for people in rental properties, right? So it's really nasty. And so the paper doesn't go into a lot of detail on it because it's actually still somewhat emerging. And this paper came out in 21, I think. but it's the one that gets me the most excited, as you can tell, because I work, part of my work as an analyst is working on climate delay, right? So when fossil fuel companies put forward proposed pathways that are designed to extend the use of fossil fuels and worsen emissions. And it's really, it works extremely well for a bunch of different reasons, but primarily it's because in terms of, I'm talking so generally here, the climate movement is a very big thing. But in general, it's more difficult for us to recognize bad faith proposals that sound roughly like they're doing the right thing than it is to recognize straightforward protectionism or fossil fuel company, like, denialism or pro-fossil images. So the only other thing I want to quickly mention on that, kind of a bit of a change that's happened in the past sort of 1 or 2 years, and I haven't really put my thoughts together on this whole thing because it's actually quite a recent thing. But increasingly what we're seeing is a bunch of different fossil fuel companies or lobbyists or whatever kind of rolling back greenwashing in a sense, and just being a bit more honest about what their about what their plans are. And that interests me a lot, right? Because that's a real shift in the kind of net zero world that we saw post Paris from 2015 to like maybe 2019-ish. Obviously, the conflict in Ukraine has caused an increase in the prices of fossil fuels and a subsequent ridiculous increase in the amount of profit that these companies make from selling or burning fossil fuels. And so the only way I can really conceive of what's happened here is that the smell of that money has kind of just changed their thinking entirely. They're like, why would we bother greenwashing if, we can kind of make this argument like we're necessary for energy security and energy reliability, particularly in the context of conflict. The pandemic as well played a role in this, like the massive fluctuations that we saw in oil and gas prices. And coal as well, actually. Coal doesn't get mentioned too much in this context, but it has seen some similar dynamics. And particularly if you're digging up coal and selling it, you're almost selling a ridiculous amount of money. And so Shell is a really nice example of this. So Shell were champion greenwashing, right? Like they were the absolute cream of the crop in the worst way possible. They like, you could tell that they felt it, they really felt it in a sort of, I don't mean that they believed what they were saying. I mean that the anxieties or whatever it was that drove them to put so much money and time and effort into greenwashing, they meant it, right? Like they were so worried about their own existential crisis as like a fossil fuel company. Like, oh my God, we're not a fossil fuel company anymore. That they just like, they really, you listen to I think the CEO probably didn't really feel it, but you listen to the stuff that the other people in the, and so what has happened in probably about the past half year to 1 year, Shell, like a bunch of other fossil companies, adjusted their climate targets, so they allow themselves for more production and they even allow themselves to have higher emissions. Shell dropped all of their carbon offset plans. They had a huge array of carbon offset plans, not for good reasons. Obviously, they weren't like, oh, that's very questionable. There wasn't any of that. They kind of just look, we'll just admit, So on one hand, it's good, that the carbon markets are kind of seeing a bit of a reckoning. Like this whole system of trading, one person reduces or avoids emissions, and they can sell that to a polluter. Just for anyone who's not familiar with the concept, that whole thing is seeing a bit of a reckoning. There's a lot of huge questions around whether it actually does what it says on the tin. My personal obsession in that context is the way it gets used by emitters and polluters to continue doing those things. And Shell was just like, yeah, we don't need to. Why would we spend, even though it's, 0.01% of their profits? They're like, why would we spend it? We feel confident in just emitting and just continuing our business as usual. So it's not an unusual thing. BP did a similar announcement. They I think they added about 300 megatons of emissions over the next 7 years, if I remember correctly off the top of my head. So making a tweak to their climate plan. I think you could probably make the argument now they're just being honest. They never really fully intended to do it anyway. So I didn't feel bad when I saw a lot of these things, right? Like I just kind of felt, okay, this is just a change in the way they're talking. They were never ever going to shift away from their business models, right? Like this is something that needs to be changed using other techniques, and we'll get into what to do about it in a moment.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to mention that in the context of the fossil fuel industry thing, and then just quickly going back to the paper, they've got another section in there that I think is really, really important. And sometimes, I see people really bounce between different corners of the things causing this problem, right? So you kind of see people sometimes talking about fossil fuel companies and the way that they use the concept of a carbon footprint to shift responsibility from themselves onto people. And that's obviously true. There's like a lot of documented history. BP were probably one of the worst offenders. Like they had a whole bunch of ads, like what's your personal carbon footprint, blah, blah, blah. It wasn't a particularly effective thing, right? Like they kind of do it and they still do it. But it's never really been a core part of the way that they greenwash or the way that they delay climate action. So it's kind of vanishing in that context. There's a huge chunk in this paper about lifestyle emissions. And so the way human behavior, and particularly the way we consume, enables the growth of greenhouse gas emissions. And there's actually quite a nicely explained spectrum of different things here, right? So you can kind of start with the obvious stuff, right? Which is people who have high income will kind of buy and do things that emit a lot. So if you can afford it, you might be compelled to buy a massive 4-wheel drive SUV and just drop your kids off to school in it every day. And it's a thing that happens a lot. You might be compelled to take a holiday. So the flight itself has very high emissions. I see it a lot. I live in Norway, which is a sort of a high emissions high lifestyle emissions country. People take holidays in like Southern Europe in summer. They'll kind of fly there, come back at the end of summer. Norway's a wealthy country, right? So we kind of demonstrate this concept quite well. So that is an unequal spread, right? Like the sort of the highest, just as wealth is constrained to a sort of small number of people, and most of the world is nowhere near as wealthy as the sort of like top 1%, 10%. Say as it goes for emissions, right? So people, the highest, the most wealthy people in the world are the highest emitters, and the most concentrated in terms of their lifestyle emissions. I think it operates in more ways than one, and this is really important, right? So it kind of ties into what I was just talking about, like climate delay, for instance. So people with like high lifestyle emissions act as activists or advocates for their own lifestyles, right? This is a really important aspect of this because wealth, of course, gives you a lot of power, gives you a lot of influence, and these people are wealthy, powerful influencers. And so they will, for instance, in the city where I live in Oslo, outside on my street, there are some electric vehicle chargers being put in. And then just one street across from me, there's actually a new bike lane being put in. It's a great bike lane. It's raised, which, it makes a wild amount of difference to the experience of riding a bike here in Oslo, which is still, a car dominated city. Even though sort of 20 to 30% of the cars here are electric. The spread of bike lanes across Oslo has been very good, right? Like it's been a lot of effortful fights from activists and, sort of advocates trying to get more and more bike lanes put in, and good bike lanes too. There is one part of our city that doesn't have any, and they've been trying for a really long time. And lo and behold, it's the richest part of the city, right? So it's down near the bay. There's, huge, like massive apartments and houses down there. And there's, people, like there's a guy who was protesting a proposal to put a bike lane. And so what happened, of course, with bike lanes is that street parking goes away. And people can't abide that. They're like, I need my car storage. Where am I going to put my car? And so they protest, and they protest in ways that are, recognizable as ways of protests from, I don't know, like in the environmental justice world or things like that, right? So one guy sort of pretended to chain himself to a street pole, to protest against a bike lane being created. And it's like this rich guy who lives in this rich part of Oslo. And so I think, right, because it's not just that this guy is living a high consumption lifestyle and kind of just passively, breezily going through it, right? When that gets threatened, he will use his power and his influence and his money. Like, it's not always that they're taking themselves to polls on the street. Like, probably what's more likely happening is that they're going to have lunch with a politician and they're like, listen, I have a lot of cash and a lot of influence, and if you do this, I'm going to get really mad at you. There's a lot of background lobbying, that sort of stuff going on. So I just wanted to quickly highlight that because it's an element of, like, so the debate about wealth and emissions and lifestyles is very well known, but this whole aspect of particularly wealthy people becoming very influential roadblocks against the growth of, things that could actually make generally lives better across a city for people is a meaningful thing, right? And so you also see this at the much higher level at the COP events, which I think obviously not really working as levers for strengthening climate action anymore, but remain a sort of interesting is sort of underplaying how kind of gross the whole thing can be sometimes, but it's something worth watching in the context of, you can kind of see these dynamics playing out, and you'll see rich countries standing in the way of climate policies that would help poorer countries. Where I come from, Australia, is such a terrible example of this. From the 90s, they've been doing the exact same thing at every single COP, which is they walk up and they're like, you just cannot take any policies that will too strongly reduce emissions, because Australia digs up and sells a lot of it. Norway is not so bad. Norway at least has a guilty conscience, and goes there and actually hands somewhat meaningful amounts of money to, like, loss and damage funds and to the sort of the green climate fund and things like that. But still, Norway doesn't dig up any less fossil fuels. It doesn't make any less money from selling fossil fuels. So even though they have a guilty conscience, it's not so guilty that we will, as a country, take any material action to reduce our role in causing the problem, even though we may be slightly more willing to treat the symptoms. So this this element of lifestyle emissions gets really confused sometimes, because people, when you talk about it, people will say, stop putting the blame on individuals. You should be focusing on the fossil fuel companies. And it really just depends on the individual. I live, what I would probably on paper, where you sort of do the math of my lifestyle, it's a relatively low emissions lifestyle, right? Like, so, I don't have a car. I don't fly beyond sort of what's necessary. And it's not, the electricity supply here in Norway is very low emissions, right? Thanks to a lot of hydro. Even then, it's still way, way higher than like on a global context, right? Like, it's still an over allocation of like an emissions budget, think about the bit of the bathtub that isn't filled up yet, and who gets that, right? I'm still an over consumer of emissions, on a global context. And so, that's an important thing. I don't, like, as much as I spend my career and my life focusing on fossil fuel companies, it's still an unfair thing. And if I were to take the same philosophy that I apply to fossil fuel companies of like, you're kind of being unfair, you're taking actions that are unfair and unjust, then I have to apply that to the decisions that I make in my life as well, right? And so that comes down to stuff like, there are like council elections in Oslo, so I've got to go and vote. I've got to like try and help, like get the people who are doing the most good into power, and like that's a lifestyle choice, right? Like, to be politically engaged or not. And so I think that's inequality had been one of the core reasons for the reasons this crisis has gotten to the point where it is now. And correcting that would go a long way to helping ease what comes next in the crisis, right? So I might move on to the second part of your question, actually, because it's a good point to move on to it, because the core thing to note, of course, is that climate change will remain a crisis, even in the best case scenario, right? So let's just say we were to magically, even if we were to stop emissions today, or if we were to follow the sort of very steep downwards trajectory that you see in like these scenarios of like aligning with 1.5 or whatever, the consequences would still be catastrophic, right? Like they would cause a crisis. They would cause new crises rather, in different parts of the world. So I think that's important to come to terms with. Is that we're in a mitigation. Sorry, that's not the right word. We're basically in a phase where we're trying to minimize the impacts of the crisis, but we will never stop being in crisis, right? Like there's no cancelling or stopping the nature of this problem now. For all of the reasons that I just outlined in that paper, they took us to this point, and there's no going back. The really important thing, of course, is to look at all those look at all those things that have happened over the past 3 decades and go, okay, how do we stop it? Is there a way to stop it? Is it even possible? Like, can you how effectively can you fight against these things? A lot of them that I mentioned are deeply ingrained in sort of human society and the way we organize ourselves. And the reality is probably you can never fully stop any of them, but you could fight against some of them more than we've kind of been led to believe. My personal thing is the fossil fuel industry, and they have spent a lot of time and money trying to fabricate their necessity, right? So they kind of pretend that you basically can't live a life without them. And so something I really enjoyed from the most recent IPCC is a new focus on, and there wasn't anywhere near enough of a focus, but at least they had something on this concept that I really found very interesting. I intend to do a lot more reading about it. But it's called sufficiency. And it sort of deals with this whole unequal spread of like resources from a different angle. So not just continue the fight against inequality, continue the fight against like hoarding of resources and wealth, but also think about what it means to have a sufficient amount, right? Like your lifestyle, the amount of energy that you need to get by, the amount of material, like just physical items. Like how much do you need of it? Because of course it takes energy emissions and biodiversity, ecological impact to construct those things. And then of course, the thing that follows on is that why would you need more? Like it's a grave and serious thing to go beyond what is sufficient for you to live the life that you've decided that you need. And so it's introducing this kind of ceiling on your consumption. And it's a really, really important concept. And it doesn't really have anywhere near the prominence that it needs. But I kind of hope, and I will of course continue lending my hand to trying to make it get more prominence. Because one thing I really discovered in the world of renewables, I used to work in a renewable energy company in Australia, a wind farm company. And I think something that I've really discovered in the years after leaving that company is that wind and solar have their own capabilities and their own potential. And for a long time, it was underestimated. But we're kind of reaching a bit of a point where it's starting to be somewhat overestimated. And so an example of that is the International Energy Agency. They did a report last year called the World Energy Outlook. And they've got this like chart in there of like how much do you need to align 1.5 degrees, right? And they work backwards, right? They work backwards from the temperature target and go, okay, well then we've got an emissions budget of X, which means we need to get Y amount of energy, and that needs to come from clean sources. So we'll kind of just assume that it's like wind and solar and a bit of hydro and nuclear. And then the number that gets spat out from that is a growth of renewables that is really, really difficult. And I think there's a lot of people like myself, like my analytical sort of clean energy background, who kind of have been trained in a bad way to assume that renewables are always being underestimated and there's always more potential for more growth and more generation. And it's not always true, right? Like you kind of start experiencing this effect where you come up against more and more roadblocks. So there are environmental issues with the deployment of wind and solar. There's social issues. A lot of these are consequences of the capitalistic or also corporatist mode of deployment. So you can kind of solve a bit of it by having more state-owned power, more community-owned power. A book that I wrote a couple of years ago was about energy justice in Australia. And so, more like increasing community ownership models. That does a bit of it. Nothing does the same wonders that materially reducing demand does. So I'm not talking about energy efficiency. I'm talking about actual absolute reduction in demand. That gives you an amazing power over the fossil fuel industry when it comes to not just grid stuff, but, the whole issue of demand for transport, private vehicles, demand for gas, particularly for manufacturing, again, stuff, the material stuff that gets used by people. It suddenly superpowers basically the ability to make the most that you can out of tools like wind and solar, but not deploy them so much that they end up creating their own problems. I think that's a really, really critical thing. So yeah, this is a pathway to not solving the crisis or stopping the crisis, but easing it significantly and in a way that benefits the people who have been most exposed to it, right? So this is something that would largely happen in richer countries, like wealthier parts of the world. There are obviously people who are far below what they need to efficiency, and they need more resources and they need more access to energy, particularly the materials, like the bits and pieces that wind and solar and batteries, etc., are made out of. That is stuff that should be going to those countries that need it the most, right? Again, I'm in Norway, we're not suffering from air pollution. We're not sort of, struggling with like we're not struggling with like, air pollution from like, coal plants to generate electricity. Yet somehow we're the ones who end up, getting access to like the, material resources to purchase electric vehicles and make batteries, and all the energy required to manufacture those things. Right. So it seems a bit unjust, right? Whereas, my family in India, they should be the ones who get like, the most urgent access to the materials and resources, right? Like we are already living sufficient lives here in Norway. And so it's a really important concept, right? There's a lot of good criticisms, I think, of the material hunger of energy transition technologies or sort of machines, right? And there is a push from mining companies, particularly some of whom have been deeply involved in fossil fuels over the years, to maximize the material hunger of the energy transition, right? So they're saying stuff like, again, sorry to keep mentioning Norway, but we demonstrate so many bad things so well. We are arguing in favor of deep sea mining, right? So we're one of the very few countries. Yeah, it's really bad. It's really, really bad. We're one of the few countries in the world that is just standing up and saying, we got to do this. Like the energy transition is so urgent that we need to be going into the ocean and like dredging up this completely undiscovered and unexamined, rich, life-filled, ecological system. And very literally destroying it because we need to fuel, we need more lithium for building electric vehicle batteries, right? And it's bad faith nonsense, right? Like they actually don't care about what I just described, which is like, a sort of lean, justice-driven energy transition. Because if they really cared about it, they wouldn't then be turning around in the next breath and saying, by the way, we're opening up 6 new oil and gas fields because we can't go too fast and the energy transition will be slow. And therefore we need to build all these like new oil and gas fields, right? It's complete hypocrisy. And I'm allowed to say it because I live in Norway. it's just, it makes me very, very mad. Because as I mentioned before, these are the attitudes and the arguments and the political systems that have caused the crisis, right? This is we can kind of see, in all of the literature and all the research, like people sit down and they go, crap, how did we get here? And that's how we got here, right? Is that exact mode of extractivist sort of thinking around this. And so, it's going to cause a problem. It's going to cause a serious problem because it means that the transition itself goes slower. So I argue that a leaner, more sort of, not obsessing over growth at all costs type transition. Sorry, I know there's a much better way of putting that. I just don't know. I just don't know how to say it because, again, it's not my thing. But basically focusing on demand reductions, significant demand reductions, particularly in like the sort of most energy hungry, wealthiest parts of the world, that results in a higher chance of lower emissions, much better outcomes in terms of like direct air pollution and climate impacts, all that sort of stuff. And just to quickly bring it back to my own experience, I worked in like analytics for a wind farm company, but then I changed over very quickly into the community engagement side of things, right? And I worked for a private corporation in Australia, and their attitude towards community engagement was okay. Like it was like there were much worse people than what they were doing, but it kind of demonstrated the principle that a company that puts its shareholders before people does not thrive, right? Like it actually thanks to the people power around those communities, they kind of decided like, well, we don't really want this happening in our community. And you compare it to community owned projects. So, I've been to a few in Denmark and Germany, and, which two countries, which once led the world in community power, kind of waned a little bit. Unfortunately, there's a lot more happening in like other parts of the world. But those projects, they do really well, right? Like people really they take ownership in it. They tend to be smaller. They tend to be more focused on local needs. And then you kind of do the math, you put it all together, and you combine it with those other pathways. And then it makes the crisis become a lot more minimizable. I know that's not an exciting way of describing a particularly sort of, energy-filled way of describing taking action is minimizing a crisis, but this is fundamentally the stage we're at now. And I think that's a really important sort of, it just packages together all those different things that I mentioned that have caused it. And on fossil fuel companies in particular, I really come down hard on the strong regulation side, right? So we actually really need to strongly fight for laws that introduce punishments for lying, for deception, basically any actions that are consciously trying to extend the life of fossil fuels. This is a really tough nut to crack because no legislator wants to go, oh, okay, I'm going to introduce a penalty for Shell talking about green hydrogen, right? That doesn't sit right with them. They're like, no, they're trying. What are you doing? What are you against the company trying? And it means you have to kind of go, read between the lines, look at the actual numbers on their paper, when you actually write it all down, it's like, okay, well, the emissions are going to stay flat out to the next 10 years. So that's everything you need there, right? Like they're trying to facilitate the worst case scenario for us. They're trying everything in their power. It is actually worth mentioning quickly that it is actually us or them. Like it's not like that sounds like a trite or like oversimplified way of describing it. But this is a mathematical thing, right? Like if they sell enough fossil fuels to, realize their dreams about their business, and those fossil fuels get burnt, and we suffer physical consequences, right? Like there is only one way it can go. It's like a seesaw, and it's just like it's so simple. And I think people are already like, oh, more complex than that, or it's not, right? Like Shell look at the different scenarios for the future and they point at the one that has the highest emissions. They're like, that's the best for us. That's what we want. We're going to try to make that happen. Sometimes they do it openly, sometimes they do it sneakily. It's not just Shell, obviously. I could talk endlessly about all the other examples, but that is really, I kind of see that as a little bit separate to the whole issue of like energy justice and sufficiency and, how you deploy, solutions and material resources. Fossil fuel companies are their own thing. And the fundamental thing, I talk about this a lot and people criticize me and they'll sort of say, well, you can't shut fossil fuels off overnight. And it really bugs me. It really bugs me when people say that, because that's not what's being debated here. What's being debated is either we go fast as possible or slow as possible. And fossil fuel companies are in the second camp, right? Like they're sort of saying, we want to slow the decline as much as possible. And just to bring it all back to our bathtub, that's the thing that makes it overflow, right? It's because they're like, yeah, you can turn the tap off, but just turn it off very, very slowly. And so you can see it day to day, you look at the press releases and the news articles and stuff like that for fossil fuel companies. That is exactly what they're doing, right? So they'll say like, the war in Ukraine, we got to really, that's why we're building these like 3 new gas fields. And then once those are underway, they better make sure that someone's going to burn that gas, because otherwise they're left with stranded assets, which is their worst nightmare. So whether they do it again, explicitly or implicitly, they will find somebody to burn that gas, even if there is a push to reduce demand. They're like, shit, well, someone's got to burn it. So yeah, new supply, of course, creates new incentives for them to manufacture demand for fossil fuels. So yeah, sorry, that was a journey through this one paper, but it's a good one. It summarizes so much. It summarizes so much in one little go. I appreciate it.
That was brilliant. Oh my God. I feel like we've almost just covered everything. I suppose the one thing that I would like to pick out, there's a couple of bits. Let's see if they come together in one coherent train of thought. So the sufficiency thing, like sufficiency, I suppose, in like a world of unequal geopolitics, like who gets to decide what is sufficient for each country level? Because what we might see happen is just sort of this like continuation of like neo-imperialism, where countries like the United States go, well, listen, like it's actually going to be impossible to ask our citizens to lower their consumption and emissions to that which the UN suggests. So we're just going to take a bigger part of the pie. It's going to be inequitable, but that's the only way forward. That's a possibility. And also this thing about, us or them, I suppose from a comms perspective, right? When I was in Papua New Guinea, I spoke with these fossil fuel execs, and I mean, it was like talking to you. Like they are panicked. They know what they've done. They're totally panicked. They don't know if we're going to get out in time. They were talking about like, this is really our last deal, and then we're going to the company's totally transitioning. And I was shocked, I suppose, by how they were entered into that conversation, or the way that they were speaking to me. I was like, they are just like us. And I don't know, it just, for me, it kind of signals the systems dynamic part of the equation, which is like, are companies just behaving in ways that they actually have to within this economic system of for-profit maximization, maximizing shareholders, all this kind of thing. Like I really don't see very many people taking decisions that, how do I put this? I don't really see anybody taking decisions anywhere that as if they have sort of an element of like free will, say, because to take a kind of creative decisions like, no, we're going to absolutely stop this. We are going to stop the train of history going off down this track, and it has been built to go down this track for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. No, we're going to change direction. I mean, the amount of energy that takes, the amount of energy, the amount of support that you would need, the attacks that would immediately come from all sides in order to try and like disempower anybody who was trying. Do you know what I mean? It's like, it's a system dynamic thing. So like, I'm quite wary now of, I used to be really big on the us and them. I'm quite wary now of that rhetoric, because I feel like it empowers people unfairly, when really what we need to be doing is pointing fingers at those people and being like, you're just bloody idiots. You're just idiots. You're not actually wielding anything impressive. You don't have clever thoughts. You're not doing anything. Yeah, you're not powerful. You are just behaving as anybody in your position should. And that is not something that should be lauded as evil, quite frankly. It should be lauded as basic bitch.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, I see what you're saying. A sort of nice example of that is I produced this chart like a month ago, 2 months ago, something like that. And it was a very obvious chart, right? Like, it is not as surprising. I like to restate obvious things from time to time because I feel like it's important. And this is a chart of the amount of investment that fossil fuel companies have been putting into clean energy as a proportion of how much they put into banning fossil fuels.
I think I saw your chart. Yes.
Yeah. Like, you don't even need to see it, right? Like, you just know, you kind of instinctively know what it's going to say. And it was like, the reason I made it is because there was a new report that came out from a really great NGO called Influence Map that looked at greenwashing. So that, like, the fossil fuel companies, like, 60 to 70% of what they talk about is clean energy, blah blah blah. And I thought it was a nice little bit of data just to buttress the fact that they're lying so much about this. And I posted it, and a lot of the responses were like, "It's foolish to expect a fossil fuel company to suddenly become a clean energy company. Like, why did you expect? What did you expect when you made this chart?" And I'm like, no, I didn't expect them to become a fossil. I didn't expect them to transition into a clean energy company. I expect them to get, kind of slapped for lying. Like, this is what I'm going for, right? Like, I don't want them to, like, I don't think it would actually be a good thing at all if suddenly, like, 50% of the renewable energy in, say, the UK was owned by Shell. That would be a terrible thing. They would build it in the same way they build fossil fuels, right? Which is like railroading communities and making sure the profits go to them and not to the people around them. Like, it would be terrible. I really don't want fossil fuel companies being renewable energy companies. They need to disappear, right? Like, they need to be erased. And the very first step in that is taking away the upwards pressure that they provide to turning the tap open wider. That's the very first step. It's the sort of they need to have that power taken away from them, of influencing. And I certainly see what you're saying in terms of, like, this is a systemic thing. They're certainly not going to behave any differently, right? It's not like you can't really expect them to sort of take some sort of moral realization of, like, oh my God, what have I done? I'm gonna change my ways. Because they would have 10 people next to them who would be like, well, now that you have that realization, you're getting kicked out. We're going to socially shame you. You're going to get kicked out of the boardroom. You can't make decisions for us anymore. Yeah. And the chances of all 10 of them having that same realization are almost nil. So there is an inbuilt system of protectionism that, like, even if one person has a moment, they're not all going to have the moment. There's too many of them. And so, that's why I think regulation is really important. And very quickly, I got to go in a minute, but your point about people not liking having things taken away from them on the sufficiency thing, and governments looking at that and going, oh crap, well, we can't, we don't want to be the ones, like, to be seen to be taking things away. So, like, the US, their policy, the Inflation Reduction Act policy is all, kind of handouts of, like, oh, you'll get a new EV, you get a new heat pump, you get a new induction stove. But it's not, they don't have anything in there about, like, this would all be about 1,000 times easier if we reduce demand. This one example that I've seen a lot of recently is the use of dryers in the US, and people just refuse to dry clothes using air and sun. Like, it's just inconceivable. Like, they just don't. And I think the best answer to that is, there's no total solution, and it's still actually quite a new thing. Like, sufficiency of the concept is very sort of, like, young in the literature, but then also in practice, in deployment, people are still trying to figure out different ways to do it. And I think one way that is working pretty well so far is a bit of a bottom-up approach. So person-to-person, community-level advocacy. Most importantly, demonstrating the actual benefits of having less stuff and using less energy. You know, life is cheaper and better, and you sort of, you know, there's a lot of low-level advocacy that can help a lot. I don't know if it's the political question, particularly, of course, in countries that, you know, I've lived in, and, you know, countries like the US and the UK. Like there's people don't like to give up having too much.
Well,
I don't know what the solution is.
I'm sure you saw recently, a few months ago, the Conservative Party, Rishi Sunak, managed to conflate having a car with freedom.
Yeah.
And said that Labour Party essentially, by wanting more public transport, wants to take away your personal freedom, and sat in Margaret Thatcher's old car for the campaign photograph. You just can't make it up. Like, it's so pathetic. Anyway, Ketan, I know you have to go. Tell me, my final question for you is, who would you like to platform?
Yeah. So, it's sort of former Twitter buddy. I mean, we're still buddies, but I mean, because Twitter is no longer a thing. Indian activist. Her name is Disha Ravi. Hopefully you haven't already had her on the podcast.
No, I haven't.
But she's fantastic. She's one of my favorite activists in the whole world. She got really done over by the Indian government. She sort of very slightly participated in producing this sort of document to help farmers protest for their rights in India against some like repressive legislation from the government. There's a lot of sort of environmental and climate elements to that protest as well. And she has been facing repression by the Indian government. I recently listened to her on this podcast called Drilled by Amy Westervelt in the US. And it was such a great experience listening to an activist who, you know, I truly can't imagine what she has experienced and is currently experiencing. Yet somehow she was like really chirpy and really fun to listen to, and just a great demonstration of the fact that activism, you know, activists and activism itself can still be, you know, really rich people and filled with life and laughter, and it's really important. I think to remember that. You know, it's an exhausting thing, and she just demonstrates that so well. That, you know, these are people that just generally get young, that want to live good lives, and fighting back against this government oppression is really, really important. So I would recommend searching her. She's on, you know, Disha Ravi. She's on Twitter, I think, and she's also on a few other platforms. And importantly, reading her story as well, because that's super important.
Ketan, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
If you want to learn more, I've put links to everything in the description box below. Remember to subscribe to the channel if you're new here, and share the episode if you enjoyed it. To support the show, subscribe at planetcritical.com, where you can read the weekly newsletter inspired by each interview. You can also become a Planet Critical patron. All links are in the description box below. As always, my deepest thanks to that community. Planet Critical wouldn't exist without your support. Thank you everyone for listening and for coming on this journey together.